right. Well, it's 7:05 and we're up to 11 people, which is pretty good. So I think I'm going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cameron Soltis, and this is an event hosted by the Halton Peel Humanist Community. If you're interested in supporting more events like this, please consider becoming a member. We have our website, hp-hc.ca, and you can click on the Join Us link to learn more. Today, I'm happy to announce our special guest speaker, Ray Argyle. Ray is the author of 5 biographies, 2 political histories, a memoir, and a novel on Victorian Canada. Today, he's here to talk to us about his latest book, Inventing Secularism, The Radical Life of George Jacob Holyoake, on the fascinating life of the man who had coined the term secularism. With that, Ray, I'll turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Cameron, and good evening, friends and members of the Halton Peel Humanist Community. I was delighted to receive the invitation through Richard Dowsett and from Cameron to talk to you tonight about my book on George Holyoake, Inventing Secularism. Let me show you the cover. There are 2 firsts that I want to lay claim to. First, this is the first modern biography of George Holyoake. There's not been a definitive biography of him since 1922. And secondly, there are no extant photographs of Holyoake in middle age, only pictures of him as an elderly man. And I thought we needed something a little more dynamic than that. So I commissioned a painter to do this creation, this impression of Holyoake at 40. So there we are. Now, I'm coming to you from Kingston, but I'm proud to tell you that I've had a long connection with the Halton Peel area, primarily through 2 newspapers in which I was involved, the Oakville Beaver and the Mississauga News, and I think they're still going strong. Now, George Holyoake is most famously known for having invented the word secularism and for his efforts to advance the 2 great causes of Victorian England, secularism and the cooperative movement. Holyoake was born in 1817 at a time when England was still recovering from the ramifications of the Napoleonic Wars. His life spanned the entire reign of Queen Victoria. He died at the age of 88 in 1906, 5 years to the day after the death of Queen Victoria. An era had ended. He was hailed as one of Britain's grand old men. I thought this evening I might tell you about some of the reasons why I wrote this biography of George Holyoake and where I think we stand with secularism in the 21st century. I decided to write Inventing Secularism because of the astonishing and appalling attacks on our democratic and secular rights that we're seeing now. They're coming from religious factions backed by populist and autocratic regimes around the world. I see this book as a way of defending one of the greatest movements in history. I'm referring to the shift to independent thought, scientific inquiry, and free thought that came with secularism. Holyoake lived through a period of great religious turmoil in the United Kingdom. People were abandoning their churches, especially the Church of England. Only 1/4 of the population were regular churchgoers. Holyoake was a radical social reformer. He had a ringside seat and played a really leading role in every social cause: universal suffrage, trade union rights, women's rights, open Sundays, secular education, you name it, and Holyoake was there. But today, he's unknown to the general public. It's my hope my book will go at least a little way toward correcting that. Holyoake was raised in a devout Christian home. He said his father was a pagan, but his mother had enough religion for both of them. He taught Sunday school in his hometown of Birmingham, but he recognized early on the inequalities of Victorian society. An early turning point for Holyoake came when, at the age of 12, his sister died after money they'd saved for her care had to be handed over as the Easter tithe for the Church of England. At that, the rector kept Eleanor Holyoake waiting for 5 hours before accepting her money. This helped turn Holyoake into a rebellious young man. He was attracted to the ideas of Robert Owen, the Welsh-born capitalist turned socialist who denounced all organized religion as frauds. Holyoake became a social missionary for Owen's Society of Rational Religion, Society of, religious rationalists, as if you could be rational about religion. Owen had a utopian vision to establish worker-owned and run communities. But the two that he did manage to set up, New Harmony in the United States and Oakwood in England, both failed. George Holyoake would have been a borderline agnostic, but for the imprisonment of his friend and colleague, Charles Southwell, on a charge of blasphemy. Southwell was editor of an atheist paper, The Oracle of Reason. Great name. He satirized the Bible as a Jew book. He was jailed not for anti-Semitism, but for calling the Bible a monstrous book filled with lust, sodomies, and slaughterings. Southwell's jailing for a year made an atheist of Holyoake. He told his flock in Sheffield that I flee the Bible as a viper and revolt at the touch of a Christian. After making a speech in Cheltenham in the west of England, Holyoake told a questioner that he did not believe in God. For saying that, he was sent to prison for 6 months for blasphemy again. He came out determined to bring an end to religion's control over daily life. It didn't take long for Holyoake to realize that atheism was an unacceptable term in the England of his day. It was a word associated with indecency and immorality. A new term was needed. Holyoake was familiar with the term secular, meaning not holy, worldly, and in a flash of insight, in 1851, the word secularism came to him. As he's explained, secularism would be a system for implementing the principle of separation of church and state. Secularism would remove religious dogma from the public sphere, from education, the courts, and lawmaking. Government would follow a hands-off policy toward religion, treating it as a private matter outside of public life. Secularism would be a way, Holyoake wrote, of promoting human welfare by material means. He added, when the priest is master, inquiry is sharply reduced. Despite Holyoake's coining of the term secularism, the man who founded the National Secular Society in 1866 was Charles Bradlaugh, Holyoake's younger and more charismatic rival. How did the relationship between Holyoake and Bradlaugh develop during their lives? What impact did this relationship have on the development of secularism in Britain in the 19th century? The rivalry between Holyoake and Bradlaugh makes for one of the most contentious chapters of their lives. Bradlaugh was younger, more vigorous, and, it must be admitted, more charismatic. He was also a better organizer. Holyoake's efforts to organize a secular society went nowhere, partly because he was distracted by other causes, especially the cooperative movement. Ironically, Holyoake had introduced Bradlaugh the time Bradlaugh first spoke at a public meeting. Bradlaugh was young, only 18, and obnoxious. After Holyoake closed his own radical paper, The Reasoner, Bradlaugh started up another, The National Reformer. The two tried working together, but it wasn't to be. Disagreement was inevitable. Bradlaugh's insistence on atheism clashed with Holyoake's willingness to accept people of faith into secularism, as long as they left their religion in the church or at home. In 1870, Holyoake and Bradlaugh held a debate over 2 nights in which they argued over whether secularism required an underlying commitment to atheism. Bradlaugh, of course, argued it should and did, Holyoake that it did not. We might ask ourselves a couple of questions at this point. How far did Holyoake's attitude toward religion soften in later years? And how far did his views evolve in contrast or opposition to Bradlaugh's? Charles Bradlaugh argued there was no difference between finding belief in God impossible and being an atheist. Holyoake attacked Bradlaugh for weakening secularism. He criticized what he saw as the movement's poverty of resources. He regarded keeping clear of atheism as the first duty of secularists. Both men made efforts to bridge the gap. Bradlaugh offered Holyoake a vice presidency in his National Secular Society, but Holyoake declined, although 6 years later he did accept, but he was never active in the job. When Bradlaugh died in 1891, Holyoake gave him a fulsome eulogy. He was the most illustrious fighting propagandist ever seen, Holyoake said. Many notable people attended Bradlaugh's funeral. Among them was a young man from India studying in London, Mahatma Gandhi. For all that Holyoake criticized Christianity, he was always respectful toward individual Christian ministers. He went out of his way to hear their sermons when he was on the road or when he visited the US and Canada. You might ask, what was Holyoake like as a person? What were his strengths and weaknesses? I think he was a little shy, a little withdrawn, and probably socially conservative in his personal lifestyle. He had his flaws, as we all do, but he didn't abuse his staff, cheat his investors, or beat his wife. He was a caring father, a considerate husband, and he never asked his wife's religious views, although he made no secret of his own. He had a powerful sense of humor. He was a great satirist. He made light of his circumstances, whether he found himself in a flea-infested prison cell or in a bed-bug-ridden room in a cheap hotel. But he was a realist. He saw the world as it was and set out to change it. His chief flaw, I think, was his failure to focus on one issue at a time. He admits he tried to crowd too many ideas into his speeches. As I've mentioned, he took up every cause that came his way. European revolutionaries, open Sundays, the stamp tax on newspapers that jacked up the price of papers to make them too expensive for the working class to buy. He claimed he owed £600,000 in stamp tax on his newspaper, The Reasoner. He offered to pay it off, a shilling a week. He didn't have to, because at that point, his protestations and the campaign of the anti-tax committee won an abolition of that fee. It said he sat on 22 committees in his lifetime. If a cause didn't have an organization, he'd start one. So his chief strength, compared to flaws, I think, was his principled dedication to improving the lives of his fellow citizens. He was widely known, first and foremost, as a radical journalist. He wrote 2 million words that went into 160 pamphlets and books in the promotion of his ideas. Through it all, he suffered ill health, temporary blindness, suffered malnutrition, and a shortage of coin of the realm. But he was not afraid of death. He who knows how to live will know how to die, Holyoake wrote. Let's look for a moment to the legacy that George Holyoake left Britain and the world. To begin, I think it's safe to say the average Briton, like the average Canadian, today is a secularist. In England, more than half the population identify as having no religion. Most of the old barriers against free thought have fallen in higher education, the professions, politics, business. Holyoake, by the way, was a Republican, but he didn't agitate against the monarchy or make much noise on that issue. But as we all know, the trappings of a pre-secular society are still strong in the United Kingdom today as it is in Canada. The monarchy, the Queen's role as both head of state and head of the Church of England. And in England, Anglican bishops sit in the House of Lords appointed by the church. And religious instruction is still a requirement in state schools. As a Canadian and a subject of the Queen, I believe it's time to rethink the whole principle of monarchy. Now, more than 100 countries around the world now commit themselves to secularism. But in many respects, secularism is under siege. Its future is threatened by autocratic leaders and their populist movements that are working to undermine the liberal democracies fostered under secularism. In the United States, where religion has always played a significant role in politics. The Christian evangelists of the right are pushing to have their ideas written into the laws of the land. Rights are being restricted, the right to voting, the right to freedom of choice for women, the right to share in equality of lives by Blacks and other persons of color. Discrimination on the grounds of religious belief has been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. This allows businesses to refuse service and doctors to reject patients and public agencies to withhold services to gays, transgenders, or others with whose religious convictions they found offensive. In Europe, countries like Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, once staunchly secularist, are losing freedoms to autocratic regimes. Turkey's historic museums, like the Hagia Sophia, are being converted into mosques. From the Vatican, Pope Francis has warned his flock of the alleged dangers of secularism. India, an inheritor of secularism from the days of the British Empire, is abandoning religious neutrality in public life and imposing strict Hindu practices on its polyglot population. China, with a constitution that speaks of freedom, denies it to its Muslim minority. In some other countries, secularism has become the source of political controversy. In France, as we all know, because of its insistence on the integration of its Muslim minority, a policy that I fear will never work, it's in serious trouble. Better that France should try multiculturalism, which respects the presence of a minority while ensuring everyone the opportunity to share in the opportunities of the majority. I think multiculturalism has succeeded in Canada, a country that is now a nation of immigrants. It's so taken for granted in daily life that few in English Canada give it a second thought. Only in French-speaking Quebec is there controversy over secularism. Its version of secularism, like that of France, regulates the dress of public servants. No woman who wears the hijab can ever be a judge in Quebec or occupy any other position of public authority. A step too far in the view of many. But in fact, Canada, with the exception of Quebec, has been a laggard in adopting secularism. At the time of Confederation, 1867, the principles of secularism were well known to statesmen across the Western world. These principles were almost completely ignored by the fathers of Confederation. Their focus was on promoting harmony between the English and Catholic religions of the English and French. In the interest of peace, order, and good government, it was agreed that French-speaking Canadians would keep their language and civil law, and that their schools would remain Catholic institutions. It was also put into the Constitution that Catholic schools in Alberta and Ontario would continue to be run by the Church and would be publicly funded with the taxes of Catholic ratepayers going to the schools. That situation still exists today at a cost, it's estimated, of about $6 billion a year. And religious schools are not the only sector, or not the only religious sector that receives public funding in Canada. More than 3,000 religious charities benefit from giving tax deductions to donors. The Centre for Inquiry Canada, an institution you are all aware of, I'm sure, estimates that this costs some $3 billion a year. As well, church properties are exempt from municipal taxes, another billion a year of lost revenues. According to the BC Humanist Association, the clergy residence deduction deprives government of about $100 million a year. Finally, religious organizations receive about $1 billion a year in government grants, supposedly in support of good causes, but also to support, in the words of the law, the advancement of religion. So that's a lot of money, a lot of our tax dollars that are being drained off. But that's not all. The great tragedy of Canadian history, the residential schools for Indigenous children, came about in large part from Canada's failure to adopt secular education. And it's not as if the fathers of Confederation didn't know about it. When George Holyoake visited Canada in 1882, he met Sir John A. Macdonald in Ottawa, and the two had lunch together. Holyoake would have talked up secularism, yet 2 years later, the residential schools were established under the management and control of the Catholic and Anglican churches. Imagine, if you will, the difference if these schools had been operated by qualified lay teachers reporting to respective education authorities and government. Abuses would still likely have occurred, and the aim of the schools to take the Indian out of the children would have been the same. But we might not today be searching for forgotten graves of these children if these schools had not been under church control. Humanists, I think, should be speaking out on all of these issues. There'll be the opportunity to do so during the coming federal election campaign and in Ontario in next June's provincial election. A good opportunity to ask politicians by surveys and personal contact where they stand on these issues. Make them aware that there are disgruntled constituents out there. Finally, I'd like to say something of George Holyoake's vision of the future. He looked beyond his own time, confident that, in his words, secularist principles involve for mankind a future. It would be a future of moral as well as material good. As he wrote, offering an infinite diversity of intellect with equality among humanity. With, he added, all things noble, society, the treasures of art, and the riches of the world to be had in common. Holyoake's vision rings more true today than ever. He would deplore the way we're waging war on nature and plundering our environment. It's not too late to rededicate ourselves to his idea that one's first duty is to their fellow citizen rather than to the accumulation of wealth for wealth's sake. So I hope that'll give you an overview of my take on this great man. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Quick round of applause. I know you'll be back in a couple minutes to give us a reading from the book, but what an introduction to such a wonderful man who I had never heard of. So thank you for that. I was really touched by the Bradlaugh and Holyoake story. You know, I think it's something to aspire to have that working relationship on the topic where you agree of secularism and pushing that despite the vehement disagreements on other subjects. And it seemed like a respectful relationship. And hopefully we can all learn from that, because I know there's a lot of causes. We don't agree on all of them, but the ones we do, let's widen the tent.
Indeed. Now I'd be happy to do a brief reading if that's agreeable.
Please.
From the book. From the book.
We'd love that.
The good book. The good book, Inventing Secularism. Chapter 11. How the idea of secularism came into being. When George Jacob Holyoake devised the word secularism in 1851, he gave name to a movement that would affect the life experience of millions around the world. Holyoake's secularism was founded on the idea that the duties of a life lived on earth should rank above preparation for an imagined life after death. Public morality, compassion, altruism, social enlightenment need not depend on religious foundations. This idea, as old as the democracies of the Greek city-states and as new as the radical theories of the free thinkers, Thomas Paine, Richard Carlile, Robert Owen, and others, would seep slowly into Britain's national life, changing forever the country's social and political landscape. Freed of religious impediments, blocking entry of the irreligious to higher education, the professions, and positions of influence in public life, people could get on with the business of improving their lives. Where theology regarded life as a sinful necessity, secularism saw life as a cause for rejoicing. While Holyoake saw secularism as an alternative to Christianity, he realized it would never sweep away all the remnants of a Christian age. The two could coexist, with religion remaining a freely chosen option for private life, but the state, education, science, government, the economy, devoid of religious dictates. Over the coming century, the United Kingdom embraced the substance of secularism while retaining the formality of an established church and a monarch who serves as defender of the faith. European colonialism would spread variations of secularism to much of the world, notably India, while America and France continued the pursuit of their own historic visions. The United States decreed in its Constitution that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, although the wall of separation would never be as impenetrable in America as in France or in the Canadian province of Quebec. The anti-clericalism of the French Revolution would hound the Roman Catholic Church until the Republic finally seized control of the nation's schools in 1905. There is no record of how or when George Jacob Holyoake struck on the word secularism as the defining expression of public life free of religion. He must have discussed his ideas with his good friend and mentor, William H. Ashurst, and with a newfound ally, the author George Henry Lewes. One can picture it. Holyoake up late in his rooms in Tavistock Square, London, stabbing with his pen at the sheet of paper in front of him, at his desk for hours on this midsummer night. He searches for the word to describe a single transfixing idea, one that would hasten the day when the public would enjoy a society shorn of religious regulation over every aspect of human life. His table cluttered with Latin texts, French volumes, and London newspapers, Holyoake reaches for Dr. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, still the final authority on Her Majesty's English. He finds secular, not spiritual, relating to affairs of the present world, not holy, worldly. With a flash of insight and a scratch of his pen, Holyoake creates a new English noun, secularism. Unlike today, when the language is filled with isms, using that suffix to create a new word, secularism, was an act of rare creativity in George Holyoake's time. Google secularism and you get 1,270,000 hits, an indication of the universal importance of the word in modern usage. Holyoake hinted at his forthcoming invention, his new word, in his paper, The Reasoner, and announced in a small item that on the 29th of December, at a meeting of the Free Discussion Society at the Hall of Science, he would lay before the meeting a statement of the present position of secularism in the provinces. That was the only pre-announcement he made. As to the evening, it was a tea party as well as an evening of speeches. Tea was served at 6:30. Austin Holyoake's wife, Austin was George's brother, Austin's wife played the piano and sang Praise to the Martyrs, a secular hymn. Holyoake was careful in his speech to distinguish between thoughtful free thinkers and the, quote, dissolute and the ignorant classes, unquote. So there was a little bit of class prejudice there. To make himself clear, he added, free thinkers who do think should be distinguished from those who do not think, and this can be done only by announcing a principle, defining aims, and creating an organization to attain those aims. Its chief principle should be to uphold the recognition of the secular sphere as the province of man. He invited his audience to join a newly formed secular society. It would have an air of exclusivity. We do not need everybody to join in this work. A selection of earnest men will suffice for us. The lesson of secularism, Holyoake reaffirmed, is that all man's work and devotion ought to be directed toward the things of this world and towards humanity. No, I think that'll give you a brief picture into the book, which traces his life from his childhood in Birmingham through his early days as a social missionary for the rational religionists, his invention of secularism, his quarrels with Bradlaugh, his acceptance by the intellectual and scientific class in England of the merits of secularism. And it's said, and I think with great justice, that it was his calm, unthreatening personality that enabled and encouraged men and women of affluence and education to give their support to secularism. And his work, of course, with the cooperative movement was absolutely groundbreaking because it provided English farmers, storekeepers, and shoppers with profit sharing throughout a huge network of cooperative outlets that still operate today there and in Canada and other parts of the world. So I'll put the book down for now and turn things back to Cameron.
Ray, again, thank you so much. Big round of applause.
Thank you.
All right. And so I think we're going to open up to questions in a couple seconds. Anyone
I'll do my best.
George, I saw a raised hand.
Yeah. Okay. I have two questions. One is probably a very fast one, and the second one, it's kind of slightly vague. The quick question is, you mentioned a debate between Holyoake and Bradlaugh. Is there a record of these debates? Have these ever been published?
Yes, indeed. There was a full text of the debate published. It was a bestseller, and reference to it with the name and the publishers in the book.
Okay. The second,
maybe an invitation to buy the book.
So the second and I guess vaguer question is one that I think that you have answered in a way during your talk, but I'm just wondering whether you can elaborate on it. You mentioned the word secularism, and words change meaning with time. On the other hand, you started by saying that he used the word secularism basically as an alternative because he didn't want to use the word atheism. And then you kind of went into a definition of secularism that we recognize today, which is equivalent to the separation of church and state, and so on and so forth. So the question is, and I can think of many words that are kind of that change meaning. Can you tell me how, not necessarily how he intended the word to be used in the 19th century, but how it was understood then and how it compared to how it's understood now? I think that even today, in different countries, different societies, the word means different things to different people. So where in that spectrum of meanings do you think he meant it then?
The term atheism has a long history in the English language. For a long while, the church and the government through the 16th and 17th centuries dealt with it by simply ignoring it and assuming, therefore, it didn't exist. It came into common parlance with the advent of the free thinkers that emerged late in the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, but it carried with it an unappealing interpretation. It was people thought, well, atheists were liars. they didn't believe in God, and therefore, and didn't fear God. Therefore, they had no reason to tell the truth. They engaged in indecency, sexual license, and so forth. And George Holyoake realized that emphasis on atheism as the basis of a movement to get religion out of the public sphere was going to be a very hard sell. And so he was seeking respectability, and realized he wouldn't gain it that way. And that was why he put his focus on secularism. And when Charles Bradlaugh came along, an unyielding atheist, demanding that there be adherence to that term, that, of course, was unacceptable to Holyoake, and that was the cause of their split. I don't know whether Holyoake ever abandoned his atheism. I don't think he did, but he realized that the secular had to be the method of presentation of free thought in the public arena.
But my question was about the word secularism, not about the word atheism. So in the way I'm hearing you to say that secularism was used, now in your answer, you seem to be saying that secularism was used to be the soft way of bringing up atheism. But
well, it was originally, but I neglected to say that there was that evolution where Holyoake's views softened toward religion, and he was entirely willing to accept and respect the presence of people of faith. He only asked of them that they conduct themselves as secularists, to accept the secular way of life in the public sphere, do as they wished in their private lives, entirely unpoliced, uninterfered with by government. And so he made secularism a mainstream in which all of us could swim. And if we wish to step aside to bow and pray to the God of our choice, that was fine. Do that. But when you come back into the mainstream and swim with the mainstream, there's to be no religious barrier and no religious rules on education, laws, the courts, parliament, politics, and so forth.
So is it fair to say that the evolution happened all during Holyoake's lifetime? Basically, he started with one understanding and one purpose for the term, and then later on, he kind of understood or kind of talked about secularism in the meaning we have today?
Yes, I think so. Just as the term humanism came into use in its present context toward the end of Holyoake's life. One of the early 20th century presidents of the National Secular Society was asked, what's the difference between a humanist and a secularist? And he said, well, a humanist is a secularist with a top hat. And there's some truth in that secularism from Holyoake and Bradlaugh sprang out of the working classes, whereas the first humanist British Union of Ethics was organized by academics and professionals in England. But the principles are similar. I think I like to think that if you're a secularist, you're a humanist, and if you're a humanist, you subscribe to secularism.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Excellent. Thanks for the question, George. Any other questions? Looking at Richard.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ray, for presenting this incredible man to us and kind of trying to revive him back into recognition again, which is wonderful. I'm fascinated by the fact that he existed. George existed. His life overlapped almost perfectly. Overlapped that of Charles Darwin at the same time, and they would have been going around in some similar circles, I would imagine. And I know from some items that I read that Holyoake had a lot of dealings with Thomas Huxley as well, who was obviously very much in Darwin's camp. So the question I would have would be, did Holyoake concern himself much with the science that was going on in terms of Darwin and evolution, or was he mainly in the sort of social side of things and really not so much concerned with the scientific side?
I think Holyoake was concerned with every development and every new trend in society in Victorian England. And you're absolutely right about Huxley. Holyoake and Huxley were good friends. And Huxley, of course, was famously regarded as Darwin's bulldog. And one of my chapters is entitled In Company of the Famous. And I'm able to discuss Holyoake's relationships with many prominent figures with whom he was friendly, including William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain. They were friends. But, when Holyoake was in jail, he was given a book called, the title slips my mind for the moment, that promoted the watchmaker theory. The idea that just as a watch has many complicated and moving parts and has a maker, so must the universe have a maker. And Holyoake wrote a response to that, knocking that down, asking, among other things, well, if that's the case, who made God? But Holyoake was one of the many people who promoted before Darwin's time the idea that man developed from the lower orders. I don't know about Holyoake, but the views of most of the people who did such promotion, of course, were very racist and held that the ultimate development of all mankind and the superior class of all mankind was the white European. But but there were views of the development and progression of humanity widely discussed in Darwin's time. Interestingly, as many of you would know, I'm sure, Darwin was very, very cautious and very apprehensive of being attacked by the churches and soft-pedaled his theory. And I think in the introduction to The Origin of Species, he said only the light will be cast on the origins of man. And he was very careful not to contradict or attack religious dogma in any form. So that sort of completes the round, and I do hope that if you either might order the book online or ask your bookseller to get you Inventing Secularism, or please call your public library and ask them to stock it. I would be very, very grateful, because I do want the book to be as accessible to as many people as possible, and we need to have it in the libraries to do that. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Cameron, Richard, all of you, for your presence tonight and putting up with me. And it's been a privilege, and and a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Ray. It's
Thanks, Ray.
much appreciated.
Right, yeah,
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you, Ray.
enlightening.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
Good night.
All right. Yeah. Have a good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming.
Buy the book.
And buy the book.